Eleanor placed her reserved sign on the Carrel corner as Thomas approached, ignoring it completely. The Maplewood desk had been hers every Tuesday at 9 for 6 months. His expensive leather bag slapped against his khaki pants with each step. The scent of his cinnamon-scented hand sanitizer drifted across the aisle before he spoke. "Actually, this is a first-come space," he said, sliding his laptop case onto her table. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her cataloging notebook. "I've reserved it every week," she whispered. Thomas adjusted his navy tie. "The library doesn't do reservations." His voice carried across the quiet study area. Heads turned around her. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she stared at her custom sign with the calligraphed initials EV. Her pen hovered over her notebook, ready to document every detail of this morning's encounter, the 7th such violation in as many weeks. The policy book was clear on matters of precedence, but enforcement was another matter entirely. My Carrel in Maplewood's public library was more than just a desk. It was a carefully calibrated workspace that took months to perfect. The adjustable monitor stand held my second screen at precisely eye level. The paper organizer had sections for active projects, archived research, and pending interlibrary loans. My ergonomic chair had lumbar support adjusted just right, and the task lighting cast no shadows on the reference materials I constantly consulted. The Carrel faced a window that overlooked Riverbend County's autumn foliage, providing natural light that didn't create glare on my screens. I'd spent 6 Tuesdays at 9 a.m. building this sanctuary, cataloging sources for 3 major projects, while managing the library's historical archives. Thomas Whitman began taking my Carrel 3 weeks after I established my routine. He'd arrive exactly at 8:45, place his expensive leather bag on my desk, and set up his workstation with military precision. The scent of cinnamon hand sanitizer always preceded him, followed by the quiet click of his mechanical keyboard. I first approached him on week 2, noting how his eyes widened behind his wire-framed glasses when I politely explained this was my regular workspace. "I had no idea," he'd said, moving to a different Carrel that smelled faintly of mildew and cleaning solution. The following week, he did it again. I showed him my custom sign with calligraphed EV initials, noted the date, and asked if he might reconsider using another space. He adjusted his navy tie and claimed first come first served was library policy. His laptop bag made a sharp thud against the laminate surface as he settled in. Today marked the 7th consecutive week of this pattern. My fingers traced the embossed Maplewood grain of my desk as I watched him arrange his note cards with the same precision I used when cataloging rare manuscripts. My cataloging notebook lay open on my lap, filled with time-stamped entries, witness observations, and policy citations. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I turned a page, ready to document today's encounter with the same meticulous attention I'd give to any archival discrepancy. The policy book sat on my desk, bookmarked at section 7.3, which clearly addressed precedence disputes, but enforcement remained the library's silent problem. The Maplewood grain felt smooth beneath my fingers as I watched Thomas place his monogrammed leather laptop case on my desk with a heavy thud. The scent of his cinnamon hand sanitizer filled the space before he even sat down. Today was Monday, and as usual, my Carrel was occupied by the man who seemed determined to claim my workspace as his own. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said with a slight smile, adjusting his navy tie as if this were a normal office interaction rather than an invasion of my established territory. My cataloging notebook lay open on my lap, the date circled 3 times in red ink beside the notation. 7th consecutive week. I closed my notebook with a soft thump and opened my policy book to section 7.3, which clearly outlined precedents for designated study spaces. "Thomas, as per Library Policy 7.3 subsection B, this Carrel is reserved for reference librarians during weekday mornings," I explained, keeping my voice even despite the irritation building in my chest. He glanced at the policy page, then back at me, his wire-framed glasses glinting under the fluorescent lights. "That policy hasn't been updated since 2015, he said dismissively. The library director mentioned during staff meeting last month they are moving to a first-come first-served system for all Carrels. His laptop bag made another sharp sound as he positioned it perfectly aligned with the corner of the desk. I made a note in my cataloging book. Thomas claims verbal policy override from director need verification. The air conditioning hummed above us, creating a persistent white noise that suddenly seemed unnaturally loud. Tuesday morning brought a new tactic. When I arrived at my Carrel, Thomas wasn't there, but his thermal coffee mug sat on my desk with a half-finished latte. The white ceramic bore the distinctive logo of the Daily Grind, the cafe that opened at 6 a.m. downtown, while our library didn't open until 9. A folded sticky note was tucked beneath the mug. "Saving this space. We'll be back by 9:30. I took out my phone and snapped a photo of the mug and note, then made another entry in my cataloging book with the timestamp and details of the personal item left overnight. The cleaning staff would be confused, I knew. Mrs. Peterson, who had worked at the library for 22 years, always cleaned my Carrel first thing, and now she'd have to deal with someone else's beverage. I walked to the circulation desk and left the mug with the note attached to a form for lost property. If anyone asks, I found it unattended. I told Brenda at the desk, who gave me a knowing look before placing it behind the counter. Wednesday arrived with crisp autumn air that smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke. As I approached my Carrel, Thomas stood blocking the entrance, his briefcase resting on the floor beside him. When he saw me, he didn't move. "Good morning," I said, trying to keep the tension from my voice. "If you'll just step aside." "This is my space now, Eleanor," he replied, his tone colder than the morning air. I had 2 reference books balanced in my arms, and as I shifted my weight, they slipped from my grasp. The thud of them hitting the laminate floor made several nearby patrons turn their heads. Thomas didn't even flinch. I bent down to retrieve my books, noticing how perfectly polished his shoes were compared to my practical library flats. As I straightened up, a woman nearby approached. "I saw that," she said quietly. "I come here every Tuesday and Thursday mornings. If you need a witness, my name is Sarah Mitchell." She handed me her business card with an email address circled. I thanked her and made another entry in my cataloging book, noting the witness's name and how Thomas had physically prevented me from accessing my assigned workspace. The smell of old paper and floor wax filled my nostrils as I settled into a different Carrel that smelled faintly of mildew, my books now slightly scuffed from their fall. Thursday brought an email notification on my phone before I even left home. It was from Mr. Albright, our library supervisor. The subject line read, "Meeting request reference desk schedule." When I opened it, I found a copy of a formal complaint dated the previous day. "I've received an official complaint from Mr. Thomas Whitman regarding alleged harassment," Mr. Albright wrote. "He claims you've been aggressively confronting him about his use of a study Carrel. Could you please bring any documentation to our meeting at 2 p.m. today?" The email had been sent at 8:17 a.m. with reference number COM 2023-1148. My hands trembled slightly as I forwarded the email to my personal account and opened my cataloging notebook. The entry for Wednesday's incident now had Albright written in the margin in red ink. "Need documentation for meeting," I noted beneath it. During my lunch break, I photocopied every relevant page from my cataloging notebook, including Sarah Mitchell's information and the time-stamped entries about the coffee mug. The photocopier made a rhythmic whirring sound as it consumed paper, and the faint smell of toner filled the break room. The meeting with Mr. Albright was scheduled for 2 p.m., but at 1:45, Thomas arrived at the supervisor's office with a colleague I recognized from business meetings downtown. "This is David Chen," Thomas said by way of introduction. "He's a frequent library patron and can corroborate my experiences." "Mr. Albright gestured for us to sit. The small office smelled like old books and lemon furniture polish. Thomas began his rehearsed narrative about how I had been increasingly hostile toward him while he was merely trying to do his remote work. I waited until he finished before opening my cataloging notebook. The entries were meticulously organized with dates, times, and specific observations. I turned to the page where I had documented his deliberate blocking of my Carrel on Wednesday. "I'd like to present my documentation," I said, handing the notebook to Mr. Albright. His eyes scanned the pages as Thomas shifted in his seat beside me. Mr. Albright looked up, his expression neutral. "This is quite detailed, Eleanor," he said. "Mr. Chen, do you have any documentation of these incidents you've witnessed?" David Chen looked uncomfortable as he shook his head. "I just know Thomas mentioned being bothered by someone at the library sometimes." I watched as Mr. Albright's eyes landed on the entry about Sarah Mitchell's testimony. He made a note on his own pad of paper before looking back at Thomas. "We'll need to verify these claims," he said, closing my notebook. "In the meantime, Eleanor, if you could provide copies of these records." I reached into my bag and pulled out the photocopies I'd prepared earlier, placing them neatly on the supervisor's desk. The stack made a satisfying sound as it hit the laminate surface. Mr. Albright looked from the papers to Thomas, then back again. "This is quite extensive," he murmured. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I think this meeting is concluded," he said before walking out without another word. As he left, I caught a glimpse of his monogrammed laptop case slung over his shoulder, the leather worn at the corners from constant use. Mr. Albright closed the photocopies and leaned back in his chair. "Thank you for bringing this documentation, Eleanor," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Could you leave these with me for further review?" I nodded, closing my cataloging notebook with a definitive click that echoed in the small office, the maplewood cover worn smooth with years of use. I returned to my Carrel to find Thomas had left behind a leather portfolio on the otherwise empty table. Its worn corners matched the marks on his monogrammed laptop case I'd seen earlier. I picked it up, surprised by its weight. The flap was unlatched, revealing a stack of papers inside. On top was a printed calendar, color-coded with different highlighters. Blue blocks marked Carrel 3 morning, while green blocks read Carrel 7 afternoon, and yellow highlighted Carrel 2 all day. I flipped through the pages, each showing a different week of the same pattern. At the bottom of each day were tiny initials, TW with check marks next to each Carrel claimed. The paper smelled of coffee and printer toner. Beneath the calendar was a document titled Workspace Rotation Protocol, with bullet points about maximizing productivity by alternating between library Carrels. A sticky note was attached to the top, written in neat block letters. "For review submitted to Riverbend County Library Administration, November 12. I recognized the heading from Mr. Albright's letterhead. My fingers traced the date, November 12, which was exactly 3 days after my first complaint with him about Thomas. I closed the portfolio, my cataloging notebook still in my hand from earlier. The weight of it felt different now, not just a record of inconvenience, but a collection of evidence. I slid Thomas's portfolio into my bag alongside my own notebook, the leather binding pressing against the worn cataloging cover. Outside the window, late afternoon light filtered through the maple trees lining the street, casting long shadows across the library floor. The library hushed after closing, the only sounds the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the distant drip of a leaky faucet in the men's room. My desk lamp cast a warm circle on the cataloging notebook and the portfolio I'd taken from Thomas's bag. I spread everything out, the papers rustling like dry leaves in November's chill. My finger traced the entries in my own notebook. September 15, Carrel 3, 8:00 a.m. TW present. September 17, Carrel 7, 2:30 p.m. TW present. October 2, Carrel 2 all day TW present with marked territory. Each entry had a timestamp, a description of the Carrel, and brief observations about Thomas's behavior. Thomas's calendar showed the same pattern but more systematic. Week after week, he'd color-coded his preferred Carrels, alternating between 3 locations with apparent precision. Blue for Carrel 3 morning hours, green for Carrel 7 afternoons, yellow for Carrel 2 all-day sessions. Every block had TW initialed and checkmarked, as if he were marking off completed tasks on a to-do list. The paper smelled faintly of the coffee he always brought in a thermos, and the printer toner from the library's second floor where he occasionally made copies. I ran my thumb along the edge of one page, feeling the slight indentation from where he'd pressed too hard with his pen. My cataloging instincts kicked in. Libraries thrive on organization, on systems that make information accessible and retrievable. What Thomas had done wasn't just inconvenient, it was an anti-system, disruption to the established order that libraries depend on. I began cross-referencing my notes with his calendar, looking for overlaps where his claimed time conflicted with my scheduled use. The paper rustled as I turned pages, my pencil making small check marks in the margin when dates matched. The coffee from the break room down the hall smelled too strong, bitter in the late evening air filtering through the half-open blinds. By the time I'd matched 3 weeks of exact overlaps, a clear pattern emerged. Thomas wasn't just using the Carrels, he was systematically occupying the spaces I typically used, essentially marking them as his territory regardless of who was there first. The realization settled in like dust particles floating in a sunbeam, visible only when caught at the right angle. My fingers traced the Workspace Rotation Protocol document, noting how he'd framed it as productivity enhancement when it was really a way to claim the best spots without formal reservation. The next morning, I arrived at work early to consult the library's policy manual. It sat on the reference shelf like a Bible of bureaucracy, 3 inches thick with a blue cover embossed with the Riverbend County Library emblem. I pulled it down, the weight surprising in my hands. Pages turned with a whisper as I searched for sections about study space usage, patron behavior, and conflict resolution. Near the back, I found Section 4.7, Use of Designated Study Areas, which clearly stated that Carrels were available on a first-come, first-served basis, but did not permit the claiming of territory through personal belongings or consistent presence during hours when the area is otherwise unoccupied. Further in, Section 8.2 about fair access to resources mentioned that no single patron could monopolize multiple locations or prevent others from accessing facilities based on historical patterns of use. The library air smelled faintly of old books and carpet cleaner as I sat at a study table, copying the relevant sections onto a legal pad with my fountain pen. The nibs scratched against the paper in a steady rhythm, the sound echoing slightly in the empty reference section. I prepared a timeline using color-coded sticky notes, yellow for my scheduled Carrel use, blue for Thomas's presence, pink for conflicts. I pinned them to a corkboard in the staff area, creating a visual representation of how his pattern had systematically disrupted my work. From my desk, I could see the corkboard where the timeline hung like evidence in a courtroom. The morning sun angled through the windows, making the pins gleam like tiny silver stars. Mr. Albright's office door stood open halfway, a silent invitation or warning. I knocked once before stepping inside, my cataloging notebook and the copied policy sections in hand. His office smelled of paper clips and spearmint gum from the dish on his corner table. "Morning, Eleanor," he said without looking up from his computer screen. "What can I help you with?" "I've been compiling some documentation regarding the Carrel situation," I said, placing my notebook and copies on his desk. The papers made a soft thump against the wood grain. He adjusted his reading glasses and picked up the first page. His fingers traced the timeline I'd created, the sticky notes sticking slightly to his skin. "This is quite thorough," he said after a moment, looking up at me with raised eyebrows. The morning light through his blinds cast stripes across his face. "It's a matter of systematic organization," I replied, watching his reaction. "When resources are limited, clear documentation prevents misunderstandings." He flipped through the pages, his eyes moving quickly. The clicking sound of the turning pages was the only sound in the room besides the hum of the computer fan. "I see you've highlighted several conflicts with Mr. Whitman's apparent pattern. He follows a rotation," I explained, pointing to my own calendar entries. "Mornings in Carrel 3, afternoons in Carrel 7, all-day sessions in Carrel 2. The same times I typically use those spaces. And this policy manual section?" he asked, tapping the copied page. "It explicitly prohibits monopolizing multiple areas based on historical use," I said. "Even if first come, first served is the general rule, the library has a responsibility to ensure fair access." Mr. Albright leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under the pressure. "This would be difficult to address without documentation," he admitted. "Have you spoken with Mr. Whitman about this pattern?" "I've attempted to discuss it on 3 occasions," I said, pointing to specific entries in my notebook. "Each time he references the first come, first served policy without acknowledging the systematic nature of his actions." The clock on Mr. Albright's wall ticked loudly, each second marking time passing without resolution. Outside his office window, a maple leaf swirled down to the pavement caught in a sudden gust of wind. "I'll need to address this formally," he said finally, picking up his phone. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention with such clear documentation." His fingers hovered over the keypad as he considered his approach. As I left his office, the main library floor had begun to fill with patrons. The scent of newly printed copies from the circulation desk mixed with the perfume of someone passing by. I paused at the reference desk, straightening the already neat arrangement of subject guides, my fingers tracing the embossed library emblem on each one. Thomas arrived shortly after 10, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder as usual. He stopped at the circulation desk to return a stack of books, the titles on their spines unread from my angle. The librarian, Sarah Mitchell, I believe, smiled professionally as she stamped the due dates in each one. Thomas nodded in response to something she said, his business casual attire crisp despite the late autumn chill outside. I watched him scan the Carrel area from the doorway to the reference section. His eyes lingered on Carrel 3, then Carrel 7, before settling on Carrel 2 as if checking their availability. He chose Carrel 2 today, placing his thermos in the corner as he always did, establishing his territory with practiced ease. From my desk, I could see him through the stacks, the rhythmic clicking of his laptop keyboard punctuating the library's ambient noise. My cataloging notebook lay open on my desk, filled with dates and times that now formed a pattern as clear as the Dewey Decimal System. The afternoon light through the high windows cast long shadows across the floor, making the library seem both vast and intimate at the same time. When Mr. Albright emerged from his office an hour later, he nodded in my direction with a small, almost imperceptible smile. The gesture was professional yet encouraging, a silent acknowledgement that the documentation had been accepted. He carried a file folder in his hand that didn't look empty. The air in the lobby suddenly felt charged, like before a storm, though no clouds were visible through the tall windows. As the library approached closing time, I gathered my things, cataloging notebook included. On the way out, I passed by Carrel 2 where Thomas was still working, his reflection visible in the dark computer screen like a ghost in the machine. The scent of his coffee mingled with the library's book smell as I walked past without stopping. Outside, the November air bit at my cheeks as I walked toward my car, the pavement crunching underfoot with each step. In my bag, the cataloging notebook lay against Thomas's portfolio, a collection of evidence now in motion, heading toward its inevitable conclusion. The next morning arrived with a crispness that made the library windows fog at the edges. I carried my cataloging notebook not in my usual place beside my reference guides, but in my hand, its pages weighted with evidence. Carrel 2 stood exactly as I expected, the familiar backpack resting on the floor beside Thomas's expensive leather briefcase. His laptop screen glowed against the dim morning light, displaying a spreadsheet I couldn't quite make out from where I stood. "Good morning, Mr. Whitman," I said, my voice carrying more evenly than I felt. He didn't look up immediately, his fingers still dancing across the keyboard before he finally acknowledged my presence with a brief nod. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I continued, placing the notebook on the small Carrel desk beside his coffee mug. The liquid inside still steamed slightly, a dark brown against the ceramic. "I've been keeping records of our scheduling arrangements as we discussed." Thomas glanced at the notebook, then back at me. "Records? That seems excessive, Eleanor. I find documentation helps with clarity," I said, opening to the first page where September 15th was neatly written in my precise script. "The morning you arrived at 8:17, noting you'd been here since dawn when the library opens at 9:00. He frowned, reaching for his coffee but pulling his hand back when he noticed I was watching. "Or October 3rd, I continued, flipping to another page. "When you took Carrel 2 at 8:45 after I'd already set up my materials here at 7:30. Mr. Albright appeared behind Thomas, his footsteps silent on the carpet. His eyes moved between the notebook and Thomas's face, a neutral expression on his features. "The library policy does state priority to patrons who arrive first," Mr. Albright said, though his eyes remained on the open notebook in front of him. "Not when a Carrel has been claimed with materials already in place," I added, turning a page where I'd sketched the arrangement of my reference books on the desk. "Our agreement last Wednesday specifically acknowledged this arrangement." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I don't recall any such agreement." The pages in my notebook rustled softly as I turned to November 12th's entry. Here I'd written down our exact conversation, complete with his exact words. "I don't see why you can't just use a different Carrel." "Mr. Albright's finger traced the date on the page. "This documentation contradicts your previous statements, Mr. Whitman." Thomas stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. The coffee in his mug trembled, threatening to spill. He looked from me to the supervisor, his business casual attire suddenly looking ill-fitting. "I suppose I'll find another spot," he said finally, gathering his things with quick, sharp movements. The portfolio case he carried made a thud as he dropped it into his laptop bag. As he walked away, Mr. Albright gave me a small nod. "Your system is impressive, Eleanor. We appreciate thoroughness." I watched Thomas disappear around the corner before sitting down at Carrel 2, my fingers tracing the edge of the wooden desk where a small scratch made a perfect crescent moon. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I opened my notebook to a fresh page, ready to document today's events. The scratch seemed to stare back at me, a silent question hanging in the quiet of the Carrel about what would happen tomorrow. "After that encounter, Mr. Whitman never approached Carrel 2 again. The library's official policy now clearly states that Carrels can be reserved by patrons with ongoing research projects, which my extensive documentation had qualified as. Every morning, I still arrive 15 minutes before opening, position my books just so, and make a notation in my notebook. Carrel 2 secured, November 15, 9:00 a.m. My collection of records has grown into something more than just a personal log. It's a system of checks and balances that keeps the library fair for everyone who actually needs it. Last Wednesday, I saw Thomas sitting near the periodicals section instead, his expensive laptop bag resting on an empty chair beside him. He didn't look my way, but I added a small notation to my notebook. Observed Mr. Whitman in section 3, 10:30 a.m. No conflicts noted. I closed my notebook, the leather cover worn smooth at the edges from constant use. My fountain pen clicked softly as I uncapped it, ready for whatever might come next. The scent of old paper and ink filled my nostrils as I recorded the time. Outside, the late autumn rain tapped against the window, a steady rhythm that matched my heart. The page turned with a whisper, waiting for whatever story it would tell next.